The CAPAL22 opening keynote was presented by Jessie Loyer, who asked, how can we disrupt the singular white man's joy that shapes our collections? In this keynote, Jessie discusses Indigenous relationality as an alternative to the structures of our libraries, the resurgence of Indigenous knowledge systems, and the ways we can dream a future of care for each other. Due to technical difficulties, the recording of the session didn't start until partway through. This video, however, still captures the provocative ideas and work by Jessie Loyer. Thank you for watching.
Libraries in the summer of 2020 struggled to realize that Black voices were really underrepresented in our collections, particularly local voices. For many years, I've spoken to students and librarians about the ways that Indigenous research comes to us largely from an extractive model. And for hundreds of years, the information about Indigenous peoples in our library collections were primarily from the perspectives of outsiders, of non-Indigenous researchers. So we have gaps from an Indigenous perspective in our collections that are literally hundreds of years old. So what can we do about this? So my turn is towards the concept of relationality, which is sort of big in Indigenous studies right now. It's a big discussion within that academic field. This is a picture of my wedding. I had a pandemic wedding in November 2020. And so very small, you can see there's just a small group of people, me and my husband, my parents, my sister, and my grandmother and her sister, my aunt. And the reason I'm crying and people are laughing and waving in this picture is because my husband and my sister coordinated to create a drive-by parade as we stepped out. And so just the overwhelmingness of doing things in isolation, but still being sort of surrounded by this care and relationality. So my work has been really centrally focused on relationality since 2012. I think back at my first teaching philosophy that I wrote for my annual report, and I can see the ways that I was really struggling to articulate the philosophy that I had with the terminology that I had access to at the time. And I'll always be grateful for the way that Deborah Lee articulated her own approach, in that her teaching, her librarianship was rooted in reciprocity and in relationship. But there was something else that I was really curious about, something that made more sense to me as I was turning away from English and towards Cree language, so Nihiawe-Win. Cree's concepts of relationality expanded how I use Deborah's ideas of connection. Terms like wahagotwin, which directs us to know our relationships, expanded beyond the family and this anthropological sense of kinship into our relationships with all things. And so that included, at the time of the fur trade, for example, relationships that came from commerce, but it also blows it up into non-human kin. So animals, our environment, land, water, right? What's our relationship to that? And I've thought about it for many years as, what is my relationship to information? So I understood that I sort of had this different relationship to the information that students were seeking and using, and I was helping them do that. So Wagotwin helped me to place it into context, to articulate some of the ways that these relationships require action rather than description. And to put it simply, I'm just interested in the way that we have this relationship to information, and therefore to our collections as sort of these bounded categories of information. Obviously, there's some really cool stuff that comes out of community-led archives and thinking about alternatives around care, right? How can we think beyond the systems of the library and think about care in this way? The stuff that helped me reframe so much of our relationships with information were shaped by the people that this information is attached to. So the wider community of those objects, for example. To me, that's really exciting to think about it. It articulated a genealogy that we're part of. And so rather than seeing ourselves as separate from communities, we could see ourselves as firmly rooted in these genealogies. While I draw primarily on Indigenous voices, those of you who have read my work or heard me talk know that Bethany Novisky's work is really central to thinking about kind of the community beyond the item, as well as Caswell and Seifer's work. So thinking about those affective relationships that exist in taking a feminist ethic of care to our archives, right? So Caswell and Seifer, for example, note 4 affective relationships that should shape archival work. So between the archivist and the records creator, the archivist and the records subject, the archivist and the user, and the archivist and the larger community. And it's that last one that I think we often forget about, right? Who else is deeply tied to our collections that we may not know? The concepts of relationality, for me, so tied to these library voices, So the concepts that come from a Cree perspective are embracing sort of animacy and Indigenous concepts of autochtone. And those two things coming together really help me articulate what I'm trying to get to. So I'm going to give us some examples of what relationality with our collections might look like. So this beautiful shirt is Crowfoot's war shirt, which was recently repatriated to Siksika. Now, in the book chapter, I speak a lot about how Blackfoot people speaking about these shirts help me think about the way that relationality extends to items as our relatives. And so this beautiful shirt is something that was recently repatriated. And there's a section in the book called Visiting with Our Ancestors, which talks about how some of these shirts that had gone over to Europe, they were being brought back to this space in Southern Alberta so that people could visit with them, they could see them. And Herman Yellow Old Woman has a really powerful quote from that book. And so I'll read it to you now. Our people, things from the past, way back. These shirts come from way back. I don't know how many years, generations back. Those are people who had no knowledge of reading, no knowledge of what white people were, what the Bible was, no knowledge of that. They just know how to be Blackfoot. That's where these shirts come from. So that's why, to me, I was so moved, emotional, I guess. There was the connection from where my people were today. So that emotional response that he has in seeing this work is so kind of powerful, right? We see the way that these shirts are animate, they are to be visited, right? There's sadness at the way that they've been kept away from their people. And I highly recommend the book because it really talks through lots of different people's relationships with it. Seamstresses, people that create regalia now who want to look at the way that it's created, the way that the hide was tanned, but also people that want to wear the shirts that use them in a ceremonial space. So we see that this relationality is less of sort of a treasured object, but rather a connection to a relative when we think about this particular example. We also have some really exciting work being done in thinking about digitization. So this is my late grandfather, Gilbert Anderson. This is a tape that he recorded in the 90s of Métis fiddle music. He was a champion all-time Métis fiddle player. And then I think his friend Calvin Volrath recorded this for him. Now, currently, I'm working with one of our summer students, Kelly McGillis, who's from Sudina, and she's digitizing this particular tape as part of her work at Mount Royal. But there's a connection to this work. So he had worked with ethnomusicologists. He had done work in kind of, connecting his music to sort of an academic world. And the first time I ever heard his fiddle playing, sort of after he had passed away, it was quite an emotional experience. And it's not quite the same experience that Herman Yellow Old Woman talks about when he looks at those shirts and visits with it, but it is a similarity, right? Every time we went to visit my grandparents, there would be fiddle playing. That's something that's really kind of empty from my life currently. So we can think about the ways that items like this tape hold so much more than just kind of the content, right? They're connected to so many communities, connected to so many connections. I want to talk a little bit about what we talk about when we talk about visiting. So Sherry Farrow-Rosette is a Métis beadworker. She's also a prof who brings her students into the archives to look at old archival beadwork. How is it created? How is it put together? How does that sort of fit in with what is going on there? And she voices a similar experience. She speaks about visiting this beadwork in museums and says, I had my first opportunity to sit with some very old things. I was awed by their age, but I was most struck by their familiarity, their objects encoded with knowledge, although they're sometimes impenetrable and difficult to understand. Most often sleeping on a shelf in a museum storage room, completely decontextualized from their cultures of origin. So what you see here is in the background is a beautiful old Métis children's coat that I got to visit at the Glenbow a couple of months ago. And this moved me to tears, this coat, because it's so intricate. You can see that there's quill work along the fringes, there's quill work along the back and the front. It's exquisitely made, it's been exquisitely cared for. But the thing that really got me was that on the inside, there was a tiny flap that said a child's name. It said Katie. And this Katie was so loved by someone. You think about how grubby little kids are, how they are always like getting hurt and falling down. But someone loved this baby so much to give them this beautiful, beautiful coat. And in the foreground, you can see a pocket from one of my great grandmothers, my Chapman's beadwork. So this is the grandmother that raised my dad, Clara Cunningham, who became a lawyer when she got married. And you can see that the intricacy of her beadwork at the top, you can see someone has been practicing, but at the bottom, you can see the way that the beadwork lays flat. You can see the type of beads that are used. You can see the stitch work that's there. And so that's something that exists in my own family. I can pick it up and look at it, but so many of our beadwork treasures exist in what Sherry's talking about, right? Sleeping on a shelf in a museum storage room, very decontextualized. Now, when we think about this, let's just move this along. When I think about these examples of relationality, there's often a tone of sadness, of grief to them, because frequently they're things that we've lost, right? Or they're things that we're trying to reclaim. And what I'm really interested in some ways, I'm less interested in how we fix library systems, and I'm more interested in the resurgence of Indigenous knowledge systems. And I don't mean this in a dismissive way. I just mean that often when we're talking about indigeneity in libraries, it becomes sort of an exotic addendum to our core work, right? We're going to just tack it on. I don't like the way that we think that we can continue living in systems of oppression and then tag on new subject headings as though that will fix that legacy of epistemicide, right? I'm interested in resurgence. I'm interested in cool stuff that people are doing. Now, this image that you see in front of you is something that is hard to imagine now. But this is a picture of a lunchtime at the International Indigenous Librarians Forum when it was last held in 2019 in Aotearoa in Auckland. And so you can see that there are librarians, Indigenous librarians from all over the world here, sitting together, eating, discussing things. And it's in rooms like this that are really generative, where I see excitement, right? Where you can see the way that these people who are trained as librarians or archivists are doing work that is different, right? Thinking about the way that we can think about material culture and the land in our own work. I think about Kanaka librarians who recently published a paper who are using land management concepts from Hawaii to place their work into context. So Kia Long is the kind of primary author there, but she's working with a wonderful team of people. And that shows us some possibilities. How can we turn to language and models that already exist to shape what our practice looks like? And it also really highlights for me that many of the times that we have these interventions into libraries, they often fall into the realm of pan-indigeneity. But this really rejects that idea, that Kia Long's work. And so we can think about how many of our libraries embrace the medicine wheel or 4 directions as a guiding principle when that may not be relevant to our territories. Something for us to sort of sit with, or 2-eyed seeing, which is a specifically Mi'kmaq term that often gets sort of plastered onto what we're doing anyways. I want to caution against this pan-indigeneity. It really was useful to us. It emerged as a tool in the 60s and 70s when people were organizing, the Red Power movement, the American Indian movement, and urbanization. All of that required Indigenous people from really different parts of the world to connect and find a shared language. It meant that that solidarity between nations was possible, a critical mass of people. And it means too that we have sort of particular artifacts that persist from that time that were touchstones, right? So the ubiquity of dream catchers, for example, Anishinaabe dream catchers, or the medicine wheel concept, or even the spread of Lakota style sun dances, that's really tied with the movement, right? As it kind of pushed for civil rights. Now, they were necessary tools for solidarity, but pan-indigeneity isn't going to help our libraries better serve the communities in our territories who have experienced this epistemicide that so many of the librarians that are in this picture that you see are pushing against. So I want us to think about what is possible beyond that. And I apologize for the terrible cropping of this. It says conceptual model of Indigenous systems of knowledge, and also the image is weirdly cropped, but we'll have to live within that. So I think where we start in thinking, okay, how do we move beyond this sort of pan-Indigenous perspective is understanding what Indigenous knowledge systems look like. And I noticed that there are some names from students that are currently taking a class that I teach at the University of Alberta. They recently just had this as their last week. So what I'm about to talk about in the next few minutes will be very familiar to you. So what are ways that we can sort of actively support the resurgence of Indigenous knowledge systems? I think we need to have a more robust sense of what that actually looks like. Now, this particular conceptual model comes to us from the article Centering Relationality by Sandy Littletree, Miranda Belardi-Lewis, and Marisa Duarte. And they do this work, I think, quite elegantly. I do have a TikTok specifically about this as well, if you're interested in a much shorter discussion of it. So they're interested in placing library work within its historical context, bringing definition to these terms like relationality that we frequently throw around. So it's very helpful for that perspective. But I think most importantly, they show us how Indigenous knowledge systems differ on a foundational level to the kinds of systems that we exist in within academic libraries. In the model, for me, the biggest differentiator is the clarity around verbs. And so that is that circle C, right? So the Indigenous ways of knowing. In the corner, you can see it says things like asking questions, observing, listening, the verbs that create sort of these expressions that we manage. Now, we sort of have a sense of the activities that create the objects that exist in our collections. We call them research methodologies, or sometimes if we're at a writer's fest, they might talk about their craft. But most of the time in libraries, we're really concerned with that circle D, right? We're interested in the expressions, or what we might call the containers of information. We understand how to manage those things. But in this conceptual model, the verbs are more central. They're really key to our understanding. So they're not obscured in the way that they are in the systems that we frequently work within. And a verbing action, for lack of a better term, creates multiple containers of knowledge, or what the authors call those expressions of Indigenous systems of knowledge, right? These books or weavings, pottery, that list that's on the side there. Now, this example is one that people will think through of the way that these things are co-constituted. They're not sort of one happens and then the other, but they're co-constituted, that a verb creates sort of these expressions. I gave the example to my class about a canoe journey. And so when someone is canoeing, there might be multiple expressions that are created, right? The canoe itself, it might include things like the stories that existed, what happened on that canoe journey that year. It might include things like songs, right, to keep time. It might include so many other items that are sort of connected, even a sense of the landscape. Where are we stopping? Where are we getting food? Kind of very broadly. So oftentimes in cultural memory institutions, we tend to separate those expressions. So we'd plunk the published stories, for example, if that happens, into a library. We might stick the logistic papers, right? Who hosted us? Where did we eat food? That might become sort of a part of an archives. And the physical items, like the canoe itself, might end up in a museum. So it's funny when we think about it like this, to see this process of knowledge transfer be dissected and separated into the cultural memory institutions that we'd assign. Here's a physical item, here's a published document. Yet within an Indigenous system, this seems almost clinical, right? Unthinkable. And yet this process happens again and again. It's reinscribed all the time. So for me, that's really at the center of any discussions about repatriation and how we would unite these expressions of Indigenous systems of knowledge together as a really sort of radical act of care. Because of the specificity of our collections, the way that we collect in narrow ways are disruptive of Indigenous knowledge systems. So I want to think about repatriation now. And you can see that this is the teepees at the back are from a family gathering last summer, excuse me. And then kind of foregrounded is a journey that I took to the Field Museum in Chicago a few years ago. I'm looking at a sash, so I'm a weaver as well. I'm looking at a sash to see the pattern that it looked like, that's in sort of their discovery room, right? Because I wanted to see the way that people from that place make sashes. And so repatriation are things like this, right? We were able to touch things, we're able to connect with these, we're able to visit with these items. And I find repatriation really compelling because it's the unification of these components. Now, when items are returned to us, there's sort of three things that might happen to them. First, if they come home from a museum and to a place that has a museum, they might be displayed at home by their own people. So they're able to be visited. They're able to actually be at home, and the people that that they're from can go and see them. Second is that they might be used. So in this case of this sash, they might be worn. They're able to sort of fulfill their function. They might be worn as regalia, to be feast bowls to be eaten out of, or to be used in ceremonial purposes. We can think about those war shirts as a good example of that. To me, this is a reunification that really allows for those systems of knowledge we were talking about to persist and to thrive. That these items can be enjoyed and to be active. That's a really joyful thing. And the third part, which I think connects to our ideas about wellness here, is that sometimes these items are allowed to rest. And so that includes things like human remains, right? When we're hearing about children that are being found, children's graves that are being found outside of residential schools, those bodies are being allowed to sometimes receive funeral rites, to be allowed to rest, but also items that should never have been preserved, right? That we have chosen to preserve, but they were intended to decay or go back to the earth, like Haida totem poles. I've seen a number of really lovely sort of retiring of totem pole ceremonies where people are sort of thanking these items and allowing them to return to the earth. So for me, that space for rest is really compelling because it reminds us that everything is sort of seasonal, right? If we return back to that central concept, you'll see that that ceremonial cycle, that connection to land is at the center, right? That's that sort of concept of peoplehood. And so we certainly have a seasonal cycle as academic librarians, but rest is often not tied into that, right? Where our time is to rest or where our time is to calm, to turn to something else. Part of the brokenness of the system that we work within is that academic spaces don't allow time for rest to be integrated. Now, what this calls us to my mind, is thinking about that community care. So in the book chapter, I've written that communities have called for the repatriation of human remains as a way to reunite Indigenous communities with their relatives held in collections. And it's very true, there's lots of human remains held in universities and museums across Canada. But Indigenous communities have kinship ties to other kinds of collections too, and are crying out for these relatives to come home. In order to even begin to address that rage and pain, those of us who work in cultural memory institutions must first build kinship with our collections and understand them as relatives too. Now, in 2 weeks, I'll be traveling to Toronto for a project I'm working on with Yas Morgan, where we're doing work with the Yellowhead Institute in creating a red paper on repatriation. We're tentatively titling it Bodies Back, as well as thinking about customary care and how we advocate for these relatives to come home to us. And one of the things that we'll be doing, along with my RA, Taya Reese, who's a Mi'kmaq librarian in training, we'll be kind of going to visit our own relatives at the Royal Ontario Museum and kind of doing this work of connection, which so often is absent from these kind of big institutions that we have. Now, repatriation for me allows us one way to repair these fracturing of Indigenous knowledge systems that we've talked about, and the way that we're complicit in this process. So we can work to reunite our collections with our communities. We hold items like ethnographies that hold an outsider's flawed, but still important information about culture. How often do the communities that we serve know that we have these things? So in the book chapter I wrote, when we consider repatriation of items as reuniting with their people, the original theft of these stories and material culture gets reinscribed as a recognition of the ongoing survival of Indigenous communities in a world that situates them in terms of erasure, of genocide, as a footnote of the past. By connecting with our relatives in collections, I'm really interested in a past, present, and future of indigeneity. I'm interested in a timeline that isn't a line at all, but rather that circularity. So how do we think about dreaming this future of care for each other? Like I was saying, I'm currently pregnant. I'm due in October. And I think about the way that mat leave is maybe one of the few times that institutions allow for a rest. And even then, under strict circumstances, and there's not a lot of rest, as many of you who have had small children will know very well. A friend from the US is also pregnant, and we were talking the other day, and she was considering herself really lucky in her employer. She told me, oh, they give 4 months mat leave, very generous, which is a little bit different from what I'm taking. I'm taking a little bit over a year in thinking about the needs that I have in tying to this work. So sometimes when we think about the care that is required beyond our work, we are in a relationship with the collection, but we're also in a relationship with the institution, which in some cases is quite exploitative. So what are the ways that we provide boundaries on our work when we're being called to do this work of being in more relation? How do we articulate when we can't do more, when we need more staff or more funding? So wellness is more than simply an HR webinar on stress. Rather, within a sense of our relationality, it requires us to do this work of caring for each other deeply and unselfishly. So the image that you see on your screen is this beautiful mask called Quillpocalypse Now by Graham Parody. So it's part of a wider collection called Breathe, where bead workers, sort of people who do all kinds of craft work, were called to create masks to talk about their own experiences of the pandemic. And in this, you can see that he's used a number of different materials, the quill work that we saw sort of on that older archival children's dress. We can see the same kind of quill work happening here. And in his discussion of this particular mask, he talks about imagining a world where we no longer have birch bark, and which is often what people will quill upon. So if we don't have birch bark, what else can we quill onto? And so he's using sort of this wire mesh to think through what sort of an Indigenous futurism might look like, right? That sort of persistence of culture, despite all of the obstacles. And this concept of Indigenous futurism that sort of situates his work is, I think, really exciting, because what it means is that we're not sort of tacking on historicity when we think about land acknowledgements, but we're thinking about Indigenous communities as well as ourselves as thriving in the future, right? Of emerging, of a future that emerges from an Indigenous thought. And so when we think about how do we possibly deal with the boundaries that exist on our work, where we are underfunded, we can think about the way that a concept of Indigenous futurism dreams us a future of care, where we are called to act in a reciprocal way, but within a very clearly described relationship. And so this is, I love this photo, I love this mask, but I think that it also tells us a little bit about the way that obstacle creates the need to articulate what we need to. So from the roundtable that I was really happy to be a part of, this is a roundtable. It was in the first volume of the journal Matter, the Journal of New Materialist Research. I had the chance to host a grad student a few years ago, and Olga was working on this journal and reached out to me and asked me about connecting with these other scholars. And so in the roundtable, I'm thinking about the way that these kinship laws might structure reciprocity and how we teach research. And I was thinking a lot about the way that when Indigenous researchers state their tribal affiliation, it's a rhetorical act of accountability. So it's not saying, I'm a Korean Métis researcher, that's a fun fact that you now know about my genetic makeup, but rather that I'm telling you exactly who I'm responsible for and accountable to. So it's marking the communities that make research and work possible. And so it's explicitly calling in these communities. Graham Parody's work doesn't sit alone, right? It's tied to community. It's tied to all the people that taught hide tanning and quill work and metal work, as we can see here, right? It's tied to these kind of broader connections that we think about within that kind of conceptual model. There are multiple kind of verbs that need to go into this particular expression. And so in this kind of roundtable, I was thinking a lot about the way that, the genealogy that I come from of Indigenous librarians, people like Sarah DuPont, Kim Lawson, Camille Collison, Lorraine Roy, all of these librarians who have thought through these concepts of care in our library spaces, of taking care not only of these collections and our students, but also of ourselves. When I think about that, it really reminds us that care is sort of a foundational component of librarianship in this way. And so with Wagotun animating this work, we can think about the way that our work is grounded in genealogies. So all of us come from a particular academic genealogy. We went to library school in one particular place. We work in a particular place now. There's people whose work informs our current work. Maybe we had an amazing boss. There's all kinds of genealogies that really structure our work, but we rarely kind of note them. We rarely kind of think through them. And that to me is an active care, that sort of citational kinship that should ground our work in thinking about how do we kind of make meaning from it. And so in it, I say that the work I do is grounded by my genealogies, from the work of Indigenous librarians who see the primacy of relationships in teaching information literacy, from Cree legal traditions, particularly the laws of Wagotwin and Miowitsitwin, and from an ethic of care that sees research as insurgent and not extractive. So for me, what's sort of missing from our discussions of care is community care and the land, right? Thinking about the land as a sustaining relationship and as a way to nurture these ongoing relationships. So thinking about kind of as we bring this home, when I consider this active care, we can think about what we sort of call customary care as something that might give us a sense of how to move forward. So this is a big component to the Yellowhead Institute red paper that Yaz and I will be working on. And what it does is think about customary care as how we care for items in our own sort of within the system of knowledge that we have. So rather than sort of worrying primarily about the preservation of an item, and thinking about how we classify it to enable access, we're thinking about its function, right? And we're thinking about how it exists within this model of care as well. And whether that is sort of a piece of beadwork that should be worn, whether that is something that should be eaten out of, or whether that's a story that should be told at a particular time of year, that really kind of allows us to pivot to a communal model of being in relationship. For us, I think it's a huge shift, right? We're thinking about sort of these items not as discrete individual components, but rather seeing them within the community, the customary care that they might have experienced. And it also ties us to the people, right? It really kind of forces us to do what we sometimes flatten into calling outreach, right? The connection to the communities that we're a part of. We're sort of not doing them a favor, but rather we're sort of being asked through the processes of customary care to reach out to them and to do this work. So when we're accountable to the people of the past, present, and future who are associated with these collections, then I think that our collections might shift from emerging from a singular white man's joy to really expanding into a decolonial love letter to our kin that enables this resurgence, that enables through the process of this resurgence us to provide the boundaries that we need to care not only for the items and the communities, but also for ourselves. So I'll bring us to a close now. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I'll stop sharing my screen now. So Akuse, thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Jessie. That was fantastic. We're going to open up the floor to any questions. So if you'd like to type anything into the Q&A box for Jessie, but I'm still really thinking about, I'm just checking my notes. There's so many things that you said, and I'm really thinking about and laughing about how you were referring to the Library of Congress as Thomas Jefferson's singular joy. Wow. So true.
The bees full of religion, mostly Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that was fantastic. Oh, we have a question. Okay, so Mary says, thank you, Jessie. Lots to think about for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I know it sometimes takes a minute for like things to seep in when you've been listening to someone sort of talk constantly for 45 minutes. Take your time.
Absolutely, yeah.
I have a question that might help prompt us to think through maybe getting our brains going. And one is, at the start, when we think about sort of where our own collections emerge from, right? Who are the sort of singular men that have shaped your own work? I know there may be some people from my own library, and of course I've flat, right? Obviously Mount Royal is a much more complex institution, but we can think about sort of these central ways that our libraries start and how we sort of have to work constantly against that. So if that's something that you want to share either in the chat or just have a discussion about, I'm so curious to know sort of where those singular voices are in your own library.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, we have a question from Kelly.
Sure.
You briefly mentioned the social media trolling and hate speech we encountered as we marketed your speech today. Can you tell me, how do you take care of your own well-being as a librarian who spends significant time engaging on social media platforms?
Yeah, I think I was on a podcast for the conversation last week, I think, called Don't Call Me Resilient. And in it, they talked about sort of the TikTok part of what I've been doing. And I have 28,000 followers right now, which is too many people than anyone should be really engaging with. That's way too many human beings for us to connect with. And that's a very small account compared to other people with millions of followers. But I think that for me, what autochtone does for me is to really, one time I was giving a talk about it and people were like, well, we can't be friends with our students. I was like, this doesn't tell us to be friends with our students. It tells us to be teachers to our students or librarians to our students.
Right.
And I think one of the good things about autochtone is it's often quite restrictive in that what we give to everyone is not the same. And so in older conceptions of it, there was really deliberate kind of boundaries of what that looked like. I'll give you an example. So one of the old sort of taboos was for people to speak to their in-laws of a different gender. And so women would not speak directly to their father-in-laws, or men would not speak directly to their mother-in-laws. And there's an example of this happening. This is for sort of small communities to sort of make sure that things are flowing, right, in a way that there's connection and communication still ongoing, that's kind of how it functioned. Okay. There's a story of a man whose wife goes into labor and he runs to his in-laws' house, and the only person there is his mother-in-law. And so he says to the dog, my wife is in labor, we need help. And then he goes back home. So his mother-in-law joins him. And so I think about that sometimes in the way that this doesn't ask us to be, when we say be in relationship to everything, it doesn't mean we're emptied out by that. It's not a hollowing out of all these relationships, but rather a really carefully inscribed way of relating. And so for me, I think it helps me consider what I'm giving and what I'm allowing out. And so that's sort of that boundary being really necessary, not only in our collections, but in how we relate to people that we are in relationship with, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really thoughtful way of kind of processing that. Eva also asks, I wonder if you can speak for a minute about the importance of positionality and stating that for non-Indigenous librarians.
Hi, Eva. Yeah, I think that positionality is so important. I think that what it does is it helps us think through our own biases, and not in a way where it's like to make us feel bad about things, but rather to see like the shortcuts that we have inherited, right? So how do we think through library work, maybe from the library values component, right? And so thinking about how do we think about open access in ways that are uncomplicated when they are often quite complicated, right? And so for me, I think that positionality is really important to sort of do that reflective work. When we talk about sort of customary care, a lot of it is care for ourselves, right? And the care for ourselves starts in knowing ourselves, I think. So the positionality is useful not only for like letting people know where you're coming from, but also for yourself, right? It's sort of hard work that doesn't need to be always performative, but is really necessary, I think, for knowing the gaps that we have. I know for me, disability is something that I have really had to push myself on learning and understanding. I'm a mostly able-bodied person, I think, like many of us, but the way that my life intersects with disability has changed in the last few years, and the people that I love. And so I think that that really, when we kind of come up against something that we're sort of unfamiliar with, I think it really requires us that moment of reflection and understanding our own positionality in these processes. So I think that no one's born knowing all the things. And I think that we're constantly sort of thinking about what our positionality is to all kinds of communities of care.
Right. That's excellent. Thanks. And Carol says, thank you for the keynote. You've given me / us a lot to think about in terms of how we can be relational in collections. How do we extend relationality into other library activities like instruction? I'm an instruction librarian that teaches Indigenous students in the US.
Oh, Carol, you're talking my language. I think about instruction a lot. My sort of first academic book chapter was thinking about how we consider traumatic research and thinking about emotional kind of awareness as a component of information literacy. As you can see, as we were moving through this, I sort of briefly touched on sort of rage and sadness as things that sort of connect us to these collections, but that exists in research as well. And so in that book chapter, I think it's called Indigenous Information Literacy, it's thinking about the way that when I'm helping students think through residential school records, for example, that process of sitting with those records, of looking at those primary sources, or even reading sort of secondary sources, is a process of traumatic research. And we talk about the sort of mental processes of research frequently, but we don't talk about what it does to us to sit with these stories of horror again and again and again. If you're doing, for example, a master's in this area, how does it manifest in your own body? And so I'm pulling from work of two Indigenous students, Erica Lee, who talks about that process of being sort of the violence of the academy, and then Jessie Thistle, who's talking about researching his own family trauma in sort of archival spaces, and the archives as both good medicine and a source of trauma. So in that, I think it gives us a sense of considering, how do we think about how instruction is a challenging thing, and not just sort of when we're dealing with traumatic resources, but also considering the way that the structures that we exist within, right? Sort of the push of marks being the sort of central thing, these sort of markers of assessment, the way that being in school is learning how to be in school in so many ways. And for many professors who are doing their marking, they've forgotten that that's a process, and that is something that not everyone sort of takes on immediately. Like anyone that is a prof or even a librarian, I would say, is someone who is very good in school. And so we start from this space of competence, but engaging with people that may not be in that place. So I think I would turn to that book chapter. It kind of thinks through some ideas, but largely it's considering the way that instruction is sort of a process of care in my mind. And in some ways it's harm reduction too, and in managing the way that our students are undergoing a lot of stress and trauma in the work that they do, and how they see us. I remember years ago hearing this research, and I wish I could remember where it came from. If somebody knows, pop it in the chat. It's so helpful. But that by the time that students come to the desk, they already feel like they failed. And so I think about how so much of our instruction and reference already sits within this place of people feeling like failures. And that can be so devastating in considering themselves as sort of creators of information and sort of active in an information environment. When your first introduction to a library space is through this process of failure. Devastating. And so there is a lot of care, I think, that it can exist in the processes of instruction, even as we're doing things as rudimentary as like showing a database.
Right.
It's a great question.
That is, yeah, a great answer too. And I think this is the final question, unless there's anything else. So I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Kamadi asks, how do you think this kind of community care translates to working with Indigenous students in or outside of a library space?
That's a great question. My work. So this is an interesting question too, because a lot of my students I know, or I know them from community spaces. We just had the Indigenous grad, which I wasn't able to go to this year, but that's a time when I see sort of students and their families and their kids and their parents. And that's a space where I often run into people I'm related to or that I know from other places. And I think that sometimes, due to the nature of our work being really overwhelming, right? And then the sort of need to answer questions and to engage with people who are requiring an answer from us. There is a tendency for us as librarians to sort of close us off to those community spaces because we're so tired, right? Thinking within that context of overwork, I think that the people are it's understandable that people would want to close themselves off to community spaces. And I think, though, that that's that tension between sort of an Indigenous system of knowledge where it's a collective responsibility that this system kind of persists, and librarians where we're often, in some cases, singular, right? So I think that it's that tension between our role within a Western institution and then how we might function as a community, right? And so I think that that's so important, is to really understand what is community work and what is professional work and what our boundaries are there. So yeah, I think that for me, it's going to those places is really important for giving me kind of life and understanding and being aware of what my students need, but I also understand why it can be overwhelming, especially if your institution requires so much of you and doesn't allow you to set those boundaries.
Yeah. Okay. And the last question from Franklin is, hi, Jessie. Always love listening to you present. I agree. Absolutely. I was just at a learning from the land retreat, and I've been thinking about how we bring some of those touchstones and methods into our work, which sadly are most inside. Curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Hi, Frank. Yeah, I think that, so when we think about that Indigenous systems of knowledge, it's impossible to forget that at the center is land, right? And so there's that relationality component that the authors do a really good job of discussing, but also that article from the Kanaka Maoli librarians thinking about Hawaii land management. I'm going to see if I can quickly pull this up. But in their work, I find it's really useful for considering how we might think about land as sort of a central relationship, but also a text to understand, right? So I'll just pop this into our chat here. This is the Hawaiian librarians thinking about their work. There we go. And in it, they're doing a really interesting job of thinking about traditional natural resource management systems as a metaphor for our library practices. And so you'll see it's really deeply rooted in Olelo Hawaii, so like the language. It's rooted in sort of how people understand this work. And Kawena, Kiahiahi, Siobhan, and Anne-Marie do such a good job of thinking about what are the boundaries of that, right? So how do we make those connections between those? I think that what land does for us, I think most strikingly as academic librarians, is avoid that sort of pan-indigeneity that we frequently see, right? Where it's like, let's put a medicine wheel up on the wall, which is like, maybe that makes sense, but maybe it doesn't. And so what the land does, I think, is help us understand the context that we're actually working within. So there's a difference between me being at home and me working here in Calgary, because it's a different landscape. I have different people hosting me. There's different sort of political needs that I have to attend to. And that's true of anywhere we go, right? I sort of went through culture shock when I went to be a library student in Vancouver, because again, such a different land, much more connected to ocean, which is something that me as a prairie person was very unfamiliar with, but it reminds us of that process, right? It reminds us to do that work. So that's what I think is most useful, is it gives us context, right?
Right. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jessie, and thanks everyone for joining.